Beginning in Romans chapter 2, Paul has focused on the law, the Mosaic law, in some manner continuously. In Romans 6:14, he really turned his attention to the law, and now in chapter 7, it is front and centered. But it is teamed with sin, as we're going to see beginning next week. The law has teamed with sin. Again, I'll say more about that next week. But the word law is mentioned 8 times in the first 6 verses of chapter 7. And at the end of verse 6, it mentions the idea of the law as the written code, which would be a direct reference to the Mosaic law. So it is either, the word law is either used or referenced 9 times in these first 6 verses. So this section is definitely about the law. But as we will see next week, again, the law is not the enemy. However, what we must understand is that we are bound to the law if we are not bound to Christ. So what does Paul mean by this idea? Well, we must understand that any reference to the law is referencing the Mosaic law. As I just mentioned ago, that is what the word written code would reveal to us if it was not clear beforehand. So the law given by God to Moses and passed down from century to century, passed down from generation to generation of the Israelites, who were later nicknamed the Jew, that is what Paul's focus on is, that particular law. Now, Paul's analogy of death, releasing someone from marriage and from any set of laws would certainly apply to any type of law, including man-made laws like those of Rome, the church to which he is writing. But man-made laws are not the focus. Paul has referenced the law again all the way back to Romans chapter 2. Why? Because he's addressing a church in Rome, as I mentioned before, that is part Jewish background, part Roman background, Gentile background, these two backgrounds coming together to form this church in Rome. And the Jewish part of that church found their security in the law. Again, not the Roman law, not the man-made law, but from the law of God. The law was given to them not only to follow, but also to protect. The Jews were thus the keepers of the law, and by keepers of the law, I mean not only to follow the law, they were not only to keep the law as in keep the commandments of the law, but they were to keep, they were to hold, they were to protect, they were to preserve the law, they were to keep it in that way. They were to be safeguards for the law. They were God's chosen people. And as such, they had the privilege of being the holders of God's law. But with that privilege came responsibility. And the Jews did not exercise the responsibility of keeping the law as in performing according to the law. They did not do that well. That's why the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 most northern tribes of Israel, were taken captive by the Assyrians in the late 8th century BC, approximately 725 BC, and were taken off into exile. And then approximately 140 years later, the southern kingdoms, primarily what we think of as Judah, were taken captive by the Babylonians when Babylon came in and destroyed the temple, and were able to take the rest of Israel into captivity. So despite this, though, despite them not keeping the law and being turned over into exile by God, by the true protector, many Jews still believed that their special privilege of being the keepers of the law gave them salvation. The law was what saved them. Therefore, their place with God was secure. As long as they protected the law, their place with God was protected. And that's been Paul's argument towards the Jewish Christian, against the Jewish Christian in the Roman church for over 5 chapters now. They are indeed bound to the law, as chapter 7 verse 1 says, but that binding leads to death, because sin has co-opted the law for its sake. Again, I'll talk more about that next week. The law is binding until the person dies. Thus, if someone wants to put their hope in the law, they must keep all of it. All of it. all of the law. Jesus makes this point very clear in Matthew 5:18, where he says, not even the stroke of a pen can change anything about the law. Everything must be perfect. James makes this point in James chapter 2, where he says if you break one part, you essentially break all parts of the law. But here, Paul does allow for a separation in Romans chapter 7, that separation coming when someone dies, and a metaphor that he uses here is a spouse dying in marriage. Paul wrote in chapter 6, verse 14, the grace of God has replaced the need for an absolute obedience to the law. The freedom we have from the law is not to be misused. I mentioned that in yesterday's video, in the sermon video. We see that in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, and in verses 15 and 16. But the freedom we have does provide a path to God that otherwise would not be possible when we are bound to the law. In other words, what Paul is saying throughout Romans so far, at least beginning in chapter 2, is that to live by the law is to die by the law. To live by the law is to die by the law. But God has provided another way. He has made himself available if we will die to ourselves and embrace the gift of his son. Embrace the gift of his son. Our life becomes incorporated into his life. We see this throughout Romans chapter 6. We see this in Romans chapter 7, verse 4, etc. The offer was God's to give. The choice is ours to make. But salvation is not from the law. Salvation is found in Christ alone. The offer, again, is from God. The choice is up to us.